At my husband's funeral, the last place I thought I would ever be humiliated, I watched her stand up. She was half my age, her black dress far too tight for the solemnity of the occasion, and her painted lips trembled with a mixture of grief and arrogance. "I need to speak," she said, her voice slicing through the heavy silence of the church. Everyone turned to look at her as if she had every right to be there, every right to take the microphone in front of my husband's casket. And I, the wife who had given him 35 years of loyalty, 3 children, and my entire youth, simply sat frozen on the front pew. I heard whispers ripple through the crowd. Some knew who she was. Others didn't, but I did. I knew her perfume, that sickly sweet vanilla I had smelled on his shirt collars. I knew her laughter, high-pitched and cruel, that had echoed down the line when I picked up his phone by mistake. And now here she was, standing inches away from his coffin, claiming a space that belonged only to me. My hands clenched around the folded handkerchief in my lap, the one I had embroidered for our wedding day, now damp with tears that were not just for a husband lost, but for a betrayal made public. She looked directly at me before she spoke, her eyes flashing with a satisfaction that only deepened my humiliation. "He loved me," she said, her words dripping with triumph. "He wanted to leave everything behind for me. He told me I was the reason he smiled, even when the world was cruel to him." A murmur rose from the mourners. My mother-in-law covered her mouth in shock. My eldest son stared at the floor in confusion, and my youngest daughter reached for my arm, whispering, "Mom, please don't listen." But how could I not? Each syllable felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rise and tell her to sit down, to show some respect, to remember that I was the wife, the only legitimate woman who had built a life beside this man. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed silent. I watched her bask in the spotlight of scandal, watched her revel in the gasps of the crowd as she declared, "He promised me the world. He promised me freedom from his cage." My cage, she meant, our marriage, the life I had worked, sacrificed, and bled for. The church bells rang faintly in the background, an eerie soundtrack to my shame. The coffin sat between us like a silent witness, and in that moment, I asked myself, what would you do if the other woman stood at your husband's funeral and tried to steal your voice, your dignity, your history? Would you rise and fight, or would you let her bury you with her lies? My heart raced. The mourners were hanging on her every word. She painted herself as his true love, his secret joy, while I was reduced to a footnote in my own marriage. I felt my throat close with grief, but something inside me shifted. For months I had carried suspicions, hidden evidence, small fragments of truth that pointed to something much darker than an affair. I had gathered them quietly, thinking I was preparing for a private confrontation that never came, because death took him first. But now, staring at her as she performed her little tragedy in front of his coffin, I realized this was no longer about silence. This was about survival. She ended her speech with tears, crocodile tears that fell onto her trembling hands as she pressed them to her chest. "I only wish he had been brave enough to tell the world about us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But now, at least, I can honor him with the truth." She looked at me again, and this time her smirk was barely concealed. It was her victory dance. She thought she had won. I rose slowly from my seat, every eye in the room shifting to me, the widow. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint sobs of relatives and the heavy breathing of those who sensed that something dangerous was about to happen. My knees shook, but my resolve was firm. I walked toward the front, past the coffin, past the mistress who stood there daring me to challenge her version of the truth. My voice, when it came, was steady. "You've spoken your truth," I said, staring into her painted face. "Now let me tell mine." Gasps echoed through the room. Some expected me to crumble, others expected me to lash out, but I did neither. I let the suspense build, let the weight of my words hang in the air like a storm cloud, because the truth was, I had not come to bury my husband in silence. I had come to bury the lies. And what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been waiting for this exact moment, with every document, every photograph, every damning piece of evidence tucked carefully in my black clutch. Evidence that would not just silence her, but destroy her completely. Evidence that would turn her little performance into her public execution. So I let her speak. I let her dig her own grave with her words. And then, as the room held its breath, I prepared to open mine. The first time I felt the ground shifting under my marriage was so small, so ordinary, that I almost convinced myself it was nothing. He came home late from work, and when I leaned in to kiss his cheek, I smelled it. An unfamiliar scent, sweet and heavy, clinging to his shirt collar. It wasn't my perfume, not the lavender I had worn for decades. This was something younger, something sugary, like vanilla mixed with cheap flowers. I laughed it off then, joking, "New secretary wearing too much perfume?" He smiled too quickly, too easily, and said, "You know how people are in that office." Then he changed his shirt before dinner, something he never used to do. That was the first seed of suspicion, planted quietly in the back of my mind. After that, I began to notice little shifts, the way he guarded his phone like it held state secrets, the way he stepped outside to take calls, lowering his voice even when he thought I wasn't listening. I told myself not to become paranoid. 35 years of marriage should have been enough to protect me from doubt. But one night, when his phone buzzed on the table and he was in the shower, I glanced at the screen. Just once. A name I didn't recognize. Clara. The message glowed like a dagger in the dark. "Miss you already." Counting the hours, I stared at those words until the steam from the bathroom fogged up the screen. My hands trembled, my throat tightened, but I told myself maybe it was nothing more than a silly flirtation, something harmless. I wanted to believe that because the alternative, that my husband, the man I had built my entire life with, was betraying me, was too devastating to admit. When he came out of the shower, towel around his waist, I asked as casually as I could, "Who's Clara?" His face froze for just a fraction of a second before he laughed and shook his head. "A client. You know how clingy some clients can be." He kissed my forehead and walked away, leaving me with that answer. But it wasn't the truth. It couldn't be. I tried to push it aside, to focus on my children, on my work, on the routines that had carried us for decades. But once you see the crack in the glass, you can't unsee it. I began to notice more. He started dressing differently, paying attention to details he hadn't cared about in years. New cologne, pressed shirts, shoes polished to a shine. He would hum in the mornings, melodies I didn't recognize, as if carrying secrets in his chest. At night, he'd roll away from me in bed, muttering about being tired, about work, about stress. And I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, knowing in my bones that something was wrong. The confirmation came in the cruelest, most ordinary way. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I found a receipt crumpled in his pocket. A dinner for two at a restaurant we had never been to, the kind of place far too romantic for a business meeting. 2 glasses of wine, dessert for sharing. My heart hammered in my chest as I smoothed the slip of paper out on the table. I could almost see them there, candlelight flickering between them, his hand resting on hers. Laughter spilling from his lips that had gone silent with me. I sat at the kitchen table staring at that receipt for hours, tears blurring the ink. When he came home that night, I asked softly, "How was dinner?" He blinked, startled, then quickly composed himself. "Oh, just grabbed a bite with a colleague." He didn't even flinch as he lied, and that, more than anything, broke me. Because after 3 decades together, I knew every twitch of his face, every cadence of his voice. I could tell when he was happy, when he was exhausted, when he was scared, and I knew, in that moment, he was lying straight to my face. The betrayal didn't come crashing down all at once. It dripped into my life like poison, slow and steady, until I could no longer ignore it. Every time he smiled at his phone, I wondered if it was her. Every late night at the office became a question mark hanging over my head. And every time he brushed off my suspicion, I felt myself shrinking, losing pieces of my dignity one by one. I remember one night vividly. I couldn't sleep, so I went downstairs for water. I heard his voice, low and tender, seeping from the study. He was on the phone. "I can't stay long," he whispered. "She'll notice. But I miss you. I'll find a way." My blood turned to ice. I stood there in the dark, clutching the glass of water until it nearly slipped from my hand, listening to the man I had loved for half my life, pledging his heart to someone else. He ended the call with words I hadn't heard from him in years. "Good night, sweetheart. Dream of me." I stumbled back to bed, my body shaking, my pillow damp with silent tears. In the morning, he kissed my cheek as though nothing had happened, as though he hadn't just torn me apart piece by piece. That was when I realized betrayal doesn't just destroy love, it erodes the very foundation of who you are. It makes you question your worth, your memories, your sanity. I found myself wondering if the laughter we had shared, the trips we had taken, the years of struggle and triumph had all been lies. Was I blind the whole time? Or did he simply change, slowly, until I no longer recognized the man beside me? The whispers grew louder in my head until they were deafening. I couldn't confront him then. I wasn't ready. But I knew something inside me had cracked beyond repair. And though I tried to bury it, though I tried to keep smiling for the children, for the family, for the image of a perfect marriage, deep down I knew this was only the beginning of a storm I could no longer outrun. And that was just the first shadow. I didn't know then how much darker it would get, how far the betrayal would spread, or how public my humiliation would become. But that first night, standing in the dark outside his study, listening to him whisper sweet nothings to a woman who wasn't me, was the moment I realized I was no longer his wife in his heart. I was just the woman he came home to. The first cracks were private, hidden in the shadows of my home, whispers through phone calls and receipts buried in pockets. But round two of this betrayal came with witnesses, with voices outside myself confirming what I had dreaded to believe. It started one afternoon in the grocery store, of all places, where I bumped into Carolyn, an old friend from church. She looked hesitant, her smile tight, her eyes darting as if searching for courage. "I saw your husband last week," she said finally, her voice lowering, "at La Perla, you know, that new restaurant by the river." I nodded, forcing my expression neutral, my heart pounding. "Oh?" I asked, praying she was mistaken. But Caroline's voice softened with pity, and that pity was worse than the truth itself. "He wasn't alone, sweetheart. He was with a young woman. They looked close." I forced a laugh, too sharp, too brittle. "Probably a client. You know his work." She tilted her head, studying me with eyes that saw far more than I wanted her to. "Maybe," she said gently, "but it didn't look like business." She touched my arm, offered a sad smile, and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the aisle, clutching a carton of milk that suddenly felt as heavy as stone. That night, I set the table as always, waiting for him to come home. When he arrived, smelling faintly of cologne and smoke, I asked, too lightly, "Did you enjoy dinner at La Perla?" His fork froze halfway to his mouth. He blinked once, then twice, and forced a smile. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" I asked, my voice calm, though inside I was screaming. "Business dinner, nothing more," he muttered, shoving food into his mouth as if chewing could silence me. But his eyes betrayed him. They always did. And I sat there smiling, letting him believe his lies still held power. But lies are fragile things. They unravel faster than the liar expects. A week later, the phone rang. It was Michael, one of his colleagues, a man who had known him since his early career. His tone was awkward, hesitant. "Listen, I probably shouldn't be calling, but I think you need to know. He's been leaving the office early. He says it's work meetings, but we all know it isn't. People are talking." My throat tightened. Talking about what? About her, Clara. That's her name, right? She's been around for months. He doesn't even try to hide it anymore. The room spun around me as Michael's words sank in. My husband, the man I had defended against whispers, was the subject of office gossip. The humiliation was no longer private. It was communal, shared among colleagues, whispered over coffee breaks, dissected in hushed tones behind doors. I thanked Michael for his honesty, though my voice shook, and when I hung up, I felt something in me fracture. It's one thing to be betrayed. It's another to know that everyone else knows it too. The signs grew bolder. He came home with shirts smelling of wine and perfume, his phone buzzing late at night with messages he would shield from me. One morning, while he showered, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I didn't mean to look, but the screen glowed with a message that seared itself into my brain. "When will you tell her? You promised you'd leave soon." My hands trembled as I set the phone back down, careful not to leave a trace. In that moment, I realized the betrayal was not just emotional, it was logistical. He was planning a life without me, and he was promising it to her. It was around this time I noticed the bank accounts. For 30 years, he had left the finances to me. I paid the bills, balanced the books, stretched our income through lean times, and saved during the good ones. But suddenly, statements were missing. Passwords had been changed. When I finally cornered him, asking why I couldn't log into our accounts, he waved me off. "It's complicated now. Business investments. Don't worry yourself." But I did worry. I worried enough to march into the bank myself to request copies of statements. The teller hesitated but handed them over, and when I opened the envelope later that night, my blood ran cold. Thousands of dollars had been withdrawn, month after month, in cash. Credit cards maxed out, lines of credit opened without my knowledge. There were charges for hotels, jewelry, expensive restaurants, things I had never seen, never worn, never tasted. I sat at the kitchen table. The pile of statements before me like a crime scene. Each number was a wound, each withdrawal a betrayal written in ink. He wasn't just lying to me. He was draining me, draining the life we had built, funding her existence with my sacrifices, and I had no voice in it. The next day, I confronted him, the papers spread on the table like evidence in a trial. "Explain this." His face hardened, his eyes narrowing. "Don't start, not now. You don't understand business, investments, risks." His voice was sharp, dismissive, as if I were a child pestering him with nonsense. "Don't lie to me," I whispered, my hands shaking. "This isn't business. This is her." His silence was the only confirmation I needed. He didn't defend himself. He didn't apologize. He just looked at me with a coldness I had never seen before, the kind of coldness that tells you you've been erased, replaced, discarded. That night, I cried not for him, but for myself, for the woman I had become. A woman standing in her own kitchen surrounded by proof of her husband's betrayal, yet too paralyzed by grief to walk away. But grief has a way of fermenting into anger, and anger into clarity. And clarity brought me to a decision. If he wanted to build a life with her, I would not stop him. But I would not let him destroy me in the process. I began to collect everything. Receipts, bank statements, whispered confessions from friends, messages I caught glimpses of on his phone. I built a silent archive, a dossier of betrayal, while on the surface I played the dutiful wife, because I knew one day, sooner or later, the lies would collapse. And when they did, I needed to be ready. But what I didn't expect was how quickly the collapse would come, or how violently it would drag me into humiliation I had never imagined. For betrayal is never content to remain in the shadows. It always demands an audience. And soon, I would discover that the whole world was ready to watch mine. By the time the truth was too loud to ignore, I thought the worst had already passed. But betrayal has layers, and every layer strips away another piece of your dignity. Round 3 was when the betrayal grew fangs, when it stopped hiding in bank statements and text messages and began clawing through the walls of my own family, leaving me isolated, silenced, and humiliated in ways I never thought possible. It started quietly, like gossip usually does. At family dinners, I noticed the glances, the way his sister would lean across the table and whisper something to her husband before her eyes flickered toward me, my mother-in-law. A woman who had once embraced me like a daughter began to pull away, her tone sharp, her words edged with disapproval. "You've let yourself go," she said one evening, watching me serve mashed potatoes onto her plate. "Men need excitement, not routine. Don't blame him if he needs a little distraction." I nearly dropped the spoon. I stared at her, waiting for her to take it back, but she only dabbed her lips with her napkin, as if she had delivered a public service announcement rather than a knife to my heart. I wanted to scream that it wasn't my fault, that I wasn't the one sneaking out to dinners and hotels, draining bank accounts for another woman's jewelry, but the words died in my throat. My husband sat there, chewing silently, not defending me. Not defending us. That silence was louder than any accusation. It told me everything. He had already rewritten the story. In his version, he was the restless man shackled to a boring wife. And the family, hungry for drama and too blind to question him, believed it. The humiliation spread beyond family. At my daughter's school, another parent pulled me aside with that look of false concern. "Are you all right?" she asked, her eyes darting left and right. "I heard some things about your husband, about a young woman." My blood ran cold. The whispers had reached the school, the very place my daughter should have been safe from adult scandals. That night, she came home in tears. "Mom, kids were laughing at me. They said Dad has a girlfriend. They asked me if you knew." She looked at me, desperate, searching my face for answers I wasn't ready to give. I held her close, swallowing the lump in my throat, whispering lies I hated myself for. "Don't listen to them. People make things up. Your father loves us." Even as I said the words, I could hear how hollow they sounded. The mistress was no longer content to live in the shadows. She started sending roses to his office with notes that dripped with innuendo, knowing full well the secretaries would see. One evening, when he returned home late, there was lipstick smeared faintly on his collar, a mocking shade of red. I stood in front of him, holding the evidence between 2 fingers. "Whose is this?" He looked at me with cold indifference and shrugged. "Stop acting crazy." He walked past me, leaving me holding the fabric like a fool. Then came the calls. At first they were silent calls, late at night, the line open but no one speaking. I would say, "Hello?" and hear only breathing. Eventually, a soft giggle came through once, unmistakably feminine. Another night, a whispered voice, "He's mine." My hands shook as I slammed the phone down, my chest tight with rage and fear. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wanted me to know. She wanted me to suffer. And I did. I suffered in silence. Every glance from neighbors felt like pity. Every conversation with friends felt like a test. Were they talking about me behind closed doors? Did they know more than I did? Did they see me as the pathetic wife who couldn't keep her husband satisfied? The shame burrowed into me until I could barely look at myself in the mirror. The worst moment came during a family gathering, his birthday. I had prepared a dinner, desperate to cling to some sense of normalcy. The table was set, the cake decorated, the candles waiting to be lit. He arrived late, of course, reeking of cologne and cigarette smoke. When he finally walked through the door, his mother greeted him with a hug and a whisper loud enough for me to hear. "She should be grateful you even come home at all." My ears burned. I clenched my fists under the tablecloth to stop them from trembling. As we sang Happy Birthday, I noticed him checking his phone under the table, his lips curving into a smile that wasn't for me, wasn't for us. After cake, while the family chatted in the living room, his phone buzzed and my eldest son caught sight of the message flashing on the screen. His face went pale. He looked at me, then quickly looked away. Later, when I asked him what it said, he refused to answer. "It's nothing, Mom. Just let it go." His voice was flat, his eyes hollow. That silence hurt more than the words could have. My son, my own child, was shielding his father's betrayal. That night, after everyone had left, I confronted him. "Your children know," I said. My voice shook with fury and despair. "They're not blind. They see the lies, they feel the coldness. Do you want to humiliate me in front of them, too?" He stared at me for a long moment, then said the cruelest thing he had ever said. "Maybe if you had been more of a wife, I wouldn't need another woman." The words sliced through me, deeper than any wound I had carried before. I staggered back, as if struck. For decades I had cooked, cleaned, raised children, worked beside him, supported him through every failure and triumph. And now, in one sentence, he had reduced all of it to ashes. I went to bed that night broken, my tears soaking the pillow until I thought I would drown in them. For the first time, I wondered if he wanted me gone, erased, replaced. The thought festered in me, growing darker with each day of silence, each smirk from his family, each whisper from neighbors. The final blow of that round came in the form of a letter. Not from him, not from her, but from the bank. A notice of overdue payments, a warning of foreclosure if debts were not settled. My hands shook as I read it. He had mortgaged our home without telling me. The very roof over my children's heads was now tied to his lies, his debts, his mistress. I confronted him again, the letter trembling in my hand. He didn't flinch. "Don't worry," he said casually. "She promised to help. She has money." In that moment, I realized I was already gone in his eyes. She wasn't just the mistress. She was the future he was building, brick by brick, on the ruins of our marriage. And he was willing to gamble everything, our home, our children, our dignity, for her. That was when the isolation became unbearable. Friends avoided me. Family turned their backs. My children whispered behind closed doors. The mistress gloated in the shadows, leaving traces of her presence everywhere, like graffiti on the walls of my life. And I, the loyal wife, the faithful mother, stood alone in a house that no longer felt like home, drowning in debts I didn't create and lies I didn't deserve. I thought I had reached the bottom then. I thought nothing could cut deeper. But round 4 would prove me wrong, because betrayal doesn't just strip you of love. It strips you of hope, and that final round nearly destroyed me completely. By the time round 4 arrived, I was already battered, stripped of dignity, and bleeding in silence. But betrayal has a cruel way of delivering one last blow, the kind that leaves you gasping for air, convinced that maybe life itself is conspiring against you. That blow came with his death. It happened without warning on a Tuesday evening when the sky was painted with the last light of sunset. He collapsed at his office, they said, clutching his chest, eyes wide with the shock of mortality, a heart attack. The mistress was there, not me, not his wife of 35 years. She was the one who called the ambulance. She was the one whose voice was recorded in the emergency call, frantic and shrill. "He's not breathing, hurry!" By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone, cold, still. And lying between us was the cruelest truth of all. I wasn't the one he had chosen to be with in his final moments. Grief is supposed to be pure, a knife that cuts but also cleanses. But mine was tainted, poisoned by betrayal. I wept by his bed, clutching his lifeless hand. But even through the tears, all I could see was her lipstick smudged on his collar, her perfume clinging to his shirt, and I hated myself for still loving him, even in that moment. for still wishing he had looked at me one last time instead of her. The days that followed were a blur of condolences, casseroles, and whispered gossip, but the weight that crushed me was not only emotional, it was financial. The letters from the bank multiplied, each one colder than the last. Overdue notices, foreclosure warnings, demands for payments I had never authorized. He had mortgaged the house twice over, taken out loans in my name, drained accounts I didn't even know existed. My home, the one place I thought was safe, was hanging by a thread. I sat at the dining table surrounded by stacks of paper, my head in my hands. Each document was a blade, credit cards maxed out, savings gone, retirement funds emptied, and all of it, every cent, had been funneled into his secret life with her. Hotels, vacations, jewelry, gifts that I would never see, memories that belonged to her and her alone. I realized then that when he died, he didn't just leave me alone. He left me bankrupt, disgraced, and drowning in debts I hadn't created. The humiliation deepened when his family turned on me. At the wake, my mother-in-law whispered loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, if she had been a better wife, he wouldn't have needed to find comfort elsewhere. My sister-in-law added, now she expects sympathy when all she gave him was boredom. Their words slashed at me in front of everyone. I wanted to defend myself, to shout that I had discovered the debts, that he had bled me dry, that he had chosen another woman even in his final hour. But I stood there, silent, because the truth felt too heavy to carry, and I wasn't sure anyone would believe me. Even my own children pulled away. My eldest son avoided me, retreating into his room, his eyes full of a confusion he couldn't voice. My daughter, fragile and angry, screamed at me one night, "Why didn't you fight for him? Why did you let her win?" I broke then, sobbing into my hands, because how could I explain that I had fought, silently in the dark, gathering evidence no one wanted to see, screaming into the void of his indifference? I hadn't let her win. He had chosen her over and over until the end, and then came the ultimate humiliation. A delivery arrived one morning, a wreath of white lilies with a card attached. The handwriting was elegant, unfamiliar. The message read, "To the love of my life, forever yours, Clara." The mistress had sent flowers to my house, the house she had nearly stolen with his help, daring me to break. I stood there in the doorway clutching the card, my vision blurring with rage. She was mocking me, even in widowhood, claiming what she thought was hers. That night I went through his belongings, desperate for answers, for closure, for anything that could make sense of the chaos he had left behind. In the bottom drawer of his desk, hidden beneath stacks of old receipts, I found a folder. Inside were documents that made my stomach twist. Contracts with her name, joint accounts, insurance policies that named her as beneficiary. He'd been preparing to leave me completely, to erase me from the narrative of his life. If death hadn't come first, he would have walked out the door, leaving me penniless and discarded. I sank to the floor, clutching those papers, my chest heaving with sobs. 35 years of devotion erased with a signature. A life built together, dismantled in secret. And now he was gone, leaving me to carry not only the grief of his loss, but the ruin of his betrayal. I stopped sleeping. Nights became endless hours of pacing, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage. The first kiss, the wedding vows, the birth of our children. Were they all lies? Or had he loved me once, before she appeared? The questions clawed at me until I thought I would lose my mind. The day of the funeral approached, and with it a storm I could feel in my bones. The house was full of relatives, neighbors, friends, each one bringing food, pity, or judgment. I moved among them like a ghost, my face a mask of calm, while inside I was screaming. They whispered about me, about her, about him. I heard the words mistress and widow in the same breath, as if I were no longer enough on my own. On the morning of the funeral, I stood in front of the mirror, fastening the black veil over my face. My reflection stared back at me, hollow-eyed, but there was something else there too. A flicker of fire, a whisper of defiance. Because somewhere beneath the grief and humiliation, I felt the stirrings of anger hardening into resolve. I remembered the folder, the receipts, the debts. I remembered every cruel word, every silent betrayal, every night spent alone while he whispered to her. And I knew, deep in my bones, that if she dared to appear at that funeral, if she dared to open her mouth in front of his coffin, I would not stop her. I would let her speak, and then I would bury her with the truth I carried like a weapon in my clutch. What I didn't know then was how spectacularly it would all unfold. What I didn't know was that my humiliation was about to transform into her destruction. And though it would nearly break me to get there, the fire had already been lit. I always believed grief would leave me hollow, but grief mixed with betrayal is something else entirely. It is a fire, slow and corrosive, that burns away tears and replaces them with fury. The night before the funeral, I sat alone in my bedroom. The folder of documents spread out across the bed like pieces of a puzzle I had never wanted to solve. My husband's handwriting stared back at me from signatures that tied him to her. Joint accounts, hidden insurance policies, financial guarantees that siphoned our life into her hands. But in his arrogance, in his desperation to make her real, he had left a trail too clear to ignore. As I traced his name across those papers, something inside me shifted. The woman who had sat in silence while his family blamed her, the wife who had swallowed lies and humiliation, was gone. In her place was someone sharper, harder, a woman who no longer wanted apologies or explanations, a woman who wanted the truth to rise no matter how ugly, no matter how loud. I called a friend, the only person I trusted with what I had uncovered. Richard, a lawyer I had known since college, answered groggily. But when he heard my voice, when he heard the tremor that carried both rage and desperation, he said, "Come by first thing in the morning. Bring everything you have." And I did. At his office, I spread the evidence across his mahogany desk, the bank statements, the mortgage notices, the insurance papers with her name written bold as a brand. He scanned them silently, his brows knitting tighter with each page. Finally, he leaned back, exhaling heavily. "He left you with nothing," he said. Or at least, he tried to. If he'd lived another year, maybe another month, you'd have been out on the street. His words cut deep, but they also steeled me. "What can I do?" I asked. My voice was no longer broken. It was demanding, commanding, like steel being forged in flame. Richard tapped the papers. "Legally, these documents prove manipulation, fraud. If she shows her face at the funeral, if she dares to claim him publicly, you'll have witnesses. You'll have the perfect stage. You don't need to humiliate her privately. Do it where it will cut the deepest, in front of everyone who believed her lies." I stared at him, my pulse quickening. "At the funeral?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Let her speak. Let her dig her own grave with her words. And then, when everyone is listening, when her arrogance is at its peak, reveal this. Turn the spotlight into a firestorm." He tapped the folder again, his eyes gleaming with a mix of pity and admiration. "You've been the victim too long. It's time to be the one in control." I walked out of his office with the folder clutched tight against my chest, my heels striking the pavement with a rhythm I hadn't felt in months. People stared as I passed, but I didn't care. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Soon they would know the truth. That evening, as I prepared for the funeral, I placed the folder inside a simple black clutch. I tested the clasp 3 times, making sure it held. The weight of it felt like armor, like a weapon. Every photograph, every receipt, every signature was a bullet waiting to be fired. For the first time in months, I felt calm, not peaceful, but purposeful. I stood before the mirror, adjusting the veil over my face, and whispered to my reflection, "You will not be erased." My eyes, once dulled by grief, gleamed with something dangerous. It wasn't vanity that guided me, it was dignity. And dignity, once nearly lost, becomes the sharpest blade a woman can wield. As the night deepened, I rehearsed in my mind the moment that was coming. I pictured her rising, smug and triumphant, declaring herself his true love. I pictured the gasps, the whispers, the pitying glances turned my way, and then I pictured the silence, the hush that would fall when I stood and pulled the truth into the light. That silence would be mine. That moment finally would belong to me. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew this. Tomorrow, the mistress who thought she had stolen my husband's heart would discover that I still held his legacy in my hands. Tomorrow, the family who whispered behind my back would hear the truth spoken so loudly they could never deny it again. Tomorrow, my children, who looked at me with confusion and doubt, would finally see their mother not as a broken woman, but as someone unbreakable. The fear was still there, curling in my stomach, but it no longer controlled me. I lay in bed that night with the folder on the nightstand, the weight of it a constant reminder of the storm about to break. And for the first time since he died, I closed my eyes without tears, because I knew, deep in my bones, that tomorrow I would not be the widow they pitied. I would be the woman who reclaimed her voice. The turning point had come, and I was ready. The morning of the funeral carried a chill that settled deep in my bones, but it wasn't just the weather. It was the weight of what I knew was coming. The black dress clung to me like armor, the veil hiding a face that no longer trembled. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times in my mind, but nothing could prepare me for the knock at my door just hours before the service. I opened it, and there she was, Clara, the woman who had stolen my husband's final breath, standing on my porch with a smile that dripped with victory. She was dressed in black, too, though her dress was tailored to flaunt rather than mourn. Her lips were painted a shade of crimson that screamed defiance, and her perfume wrapped around her like a declaration. She looked at me as if I were the intruder, as if this was her house, her life, her day. "May I come in?" she asked, though her tone made it clear it wasn't a request. I stepped aside, more out of curiosity than courtesy, watching her heels click across my hardwood floor. She looked around the house with disdain, her eyes catching on the faded photographs of family vacations, the worn sofa, the old rug by the fireplace. "Smaller than I expected," she muttered. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm. She turned to me, tilting her head with mock pity. "I thought we should talk before the funeral. It will be easier if we understand each other." "Understand each other?" I repeated, my voice low, steady. "You mean you want to dictate how today goes?" Her smile widened. "Exactly. I don't want a scene. I plan to speak, to honor him properly. He would have wanted that." I laughed then, a harsh, bitter sound that startled even me. "Honor him? You humiliated him. You humiliated me. You drained him until his heart gave out. And now you want to stand beside his coffin and pretend you were his wife?" Her eyes flashed with something sharp, but she quickly masked it with feigned innocence. "He loved me, more than he ever loved you. You know that, don't you? That's why you're so afraid. He told me everything, how trapped he felt, how dead he was inside this house, this marriage. I gave him life, I gave him joy." I stepped closer, the anger pulsing in my veins. "You gave him debts. You gave him shame. You gave him the pressure that killed him." For the first time, her smile faltered, but then she leaned in close enough that I could smell the wine on her breath. "You think anyone will believe that? They all see you as the bitter wife, the abandoned woman. At the funeral, when I speak, they'll see me as the one he truly loved. They'll remember me. Not you." Her words sliced, But I didn't flinch. I wanted her to see nothing, to think I was beaten, because her arrogance was the very rope she would use to hang herself. "Do what you want," I said calmly, turning away. "But remember this, you don't control me, not anymore." She followed me into the living room, her heels sharp against the floor. "You're making a mistake," she hissed. "If you try to fight me, if you try to silence me, I'll tell them everything, every secret he shared with me, every weakness of yours he mocked in my bed. Do you want the whole world to know how pathetic you were? How unwanted?" I turned then, slowly, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that made her falter. "Tell them," I whispered. "Tell them every filthy word, because when you're done, I'll tell them mine. And mine comes with proof." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed her face. "Proof?" I let the word hang in the air like a storm cloud, then brushed past her, opening the front door. "The funeral starts in an hour. I'll see you there." She stood frozen for a moment, her confidence cracking at the edges, before she smirked again, though the bravado was weaker now. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." With that, she swept out of my house, her perfume lingering like poison in the air. I closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a long breath. My hands shook, but not from fear, from anticipation. The private battle was over. The stage was set. She thought she had cornered me, that her threats and half-truths could crush me. But she didn't know what I carried in that clutch. She didn't know that every lie she planned to spin would meet its death in my hands. I walked upstairs, picked up the clutch from my nightstand, and held it tight. The weight of it steadied me. The humiliation, the whispers, the isolation, all of it had led to this moment. I wasn't just going to survive the funeral, I was going to reclaim it. And as I fastened the veil once more, staring at the reflection of a woman no longer broken, I whispered to myself, "Let her speak, let her burn. Today her voice becomes her undoing." The church smelled of lilies and incense, the kind of scent that clung to your throat and made every breath heavy. The pews were full, faces blurred together in black clothes, whispers rising and falling like waves. I sat in the front row, the widow in her veil, my clutch resting on my lap, its weight more comforting than any hand could be. My children sat on either side of me, stiff, silent, their eyes darting to me as if waiting to see whether I would break. I would not. Not today. The coffin stood before us, polished wood gleaming in the dim light. His portrait was propped beside it, smiling as if mocking me, smiling as if he had left nothing but love behind. I stared at that photograph, and for a moment I almost wept. Almost. But then the doors at the back opened, and I smelled her before I saw her. That sickly sweet perfume, vanilla and flowers, drifting through the sanctuary like a curse. Clara walked down the aisle slowly, her heels clicking against the stone, her head held high. The congregation turned, whispers blooming instantly. Some knew who she was, others didn't. But by the time she reached the front, by the time she stood only a few feet from me, everyone knew she was not just another mourner. She was something else entirely. She was the scandal-given flesh. She placed a single rose on the coffin, her hand lingering on the wood as though it belonged to her. Then she turned to the priest. "I'd like to say a few words." The priest hesitated, glancing at me, but I said nothing. I gave a single nod. "Let her speak." She took the microphone, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "We gather here to honor a man who was more than what the world saw. To many of you, he was a husband, a father, a colleague. But to me—" She paused, her eyes flicking toward me with the faintest smirk. "To me, he was the love of my life. The man who saw me, who understood me, who gave me joy when the world gave me nothing." Gasps rippled through the room. My mother-in-law covered her mouth. My sister-in-law whispered something harsh to her husband. I sat motionless, staring at her, my hands folded neatly over my clutch. Clara's voice grew stronger, bolder. He told me things he couldn't tell anyone else. He told me about his loneliness, about the emptiness he felt even in his own home. He said I was his freedom, his light. He promised me a future, one we'll never have now, but one that will always live in my heart. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they sparkled too perfectly, as if rehearsed. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some looked at me, pity in their eyes, others at her, torn between scandal and sympathy. She pressed on. I know this is hard for many of you to hear, but it's the truth. He loved me, and though our time was short, it was real, and I will carry that love with me forever. She ended with a sob, lowering her head dramatically. A silence followed, thick and suffocating, the kind of silence that begged to be broken. And so I stood. Every head turned as I rose from the pew, my veil casting a shadow over my face. My knees did not tremble, my voice did not crack. I walked to the front, the clutch in my hand, the sound of my heels echoing like gunfire. Clara stepped back, surprised, her eyes flickering with unease. I took the microphone from the priest, my hand steady. You've spoken your truth, I said, my voice clear, slicing through the silence. Now it's my turn. I turned to the congregation, lifting the veil so they could see my eyes. My husband was many things. He was charming, he was ambitious, he was a man who built a life with me for 35 years, but he was also a liar, a betrayer, a man who drained the life from me and gave it to someone else. Murmurs rose, people shifting uncomfortably, but I didn't stop. He mortgaged our home without my knowledge. He emptied our savings, maxed our credit, and left me drowning in debt. Not for his family, not for his children, for her. I pointed to Clara, whose face drained of color. Gasps filled the room. I opened the clutch, pulling out the folder of documents. I held up the first paper, my hand firm. Bank statements. Withdrawals of thousands of dollars, month after month, spent on hotels, jewelry, restaurants. Not with me, with her. I dropped the papers onto the coffin, the slap of paper against wood sharp in the air. Another paper. Mortgage contracts. He signed away the roof over our children's heads. For her. Another drop, another slap, another. Insurance policies. He made her the beneficiary, erasing me completely. He wanted to leave me with nothing. Clara's eyes widened, her mouth opening, but no words came. She shook her head weakly, but the proof was there, undeniable, in ink and signatures. I looked directly at her. You say he loved you? He didn't love you. He used you, and you used him. You bled him dry until his heart gave out. You didn't just steal my husband, you killed him. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. My mother-in-law sobbed into her hands. My children stared at me with wide, stunned eyes. Clara tried to step forward, but I raised my voice, cutting her off. You wanted to speak today? You wanted to claim him? Then stand here and claim the debts, the lies, the ruin he left behind. Stand here and claim the shame that you brought into this family. Her face crumpled, the bravado shattered. She stammered, That's not true. He promised. He said, I slammed the last folder onto the coffin. He promised you lies, and now he's dead, and all you have is ashes, ashes and shame. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd stared, the weight of truth pressing down on them. And then, slowly, a voice rose from the pews. Richard, my lawyer, stood, his voice steady. Everything she says is true. I've seen the documents. They are legal and binding. This woman, he pointed at Clara, was the reason he left his family in ruin. The room erupted. Whispers turned to shouts. Heads shook. Eyes narrowed at Clara. She tried to flee, but the eyes of the congregation followed her, condemning, judging. She'd wanted a stage, and she had taken it. But now the stage had collapsed beneath her. I stood there, breathing deeply, my heart pounding but steady. For the first time in months, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. power, not over him, not over her, but over myself. My voice had been silenced too long, and now it rang through the church like a bell. I set the microphone down gently, placed my hand on the coffin, and whispered so only I could hear, "You tried to erase me, but in the end, I erased her." And with that, I returned to my seat, the weight of the clutch gone, the weight of my dignity restored. The silence that followed my words was not empty. It was charged, buzzing, alive. I could feel it ripple through the congregation like a wave ready to break. Then it did. One voice after another rose, each one carrying the weight of truth, each one striking Clara down further than any single blow of mine could have. Richard, my lawyer, was the first to step forward. His suit was impeccable, his tone measured, but his words were knives. "I have reviewed every document," he said, addressing the crowd, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "The mortgages, the bank withdrawals, the insurance policies, all of it is legitimate. She," his finger pointed to Clara like a judge passing sentence, "was not just his mistress, she was his accomplice. Together they orchestrated financial ruin, and together they would have destroyed this family if death hadn't intervened." The pews erupted in whispers. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, shoulders stiffened. Clara shrank back, her once confident posture collapsing under the weight of public judgment. But the fire didn't stop with Richard. From the second row, Caroline, my old friend, the one who had first warned me, stood with tears in her eyes. "I saw them together," she said, her voice trembling but strong enough to carry. "I kept quiet for too long because I didn't want to hurt her." She turned to me, her eyes brimming with sorrow. "But I should have spoken sooner. I should have told everyone. She was never imagining things. She was always telling the truth." The congregation gasped again, but this time not in disbelief, in recognition, in shame. Then, to my shock, my eldest son rose. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but his voice carried a conviction that made my chest ache. "I saw the messages on Dad's phone," he confessed, his eyes darting from me to the crowd. "I didn't want to believe it, so I stayed silent. I thought I was protecting him. But all I did was betray her. My mother was the one who held this family together, and we all failed her." His voice cracked, and he sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. The weight of his confession hung in the air, breaking something open. A neighbor I barely knew stood up next, her voice clear and indignant. "We all knew something was wrong. We saw the flowers arriving, the late nights, the whispers, but we chose gossip over truth. And in doing so, we enabled this woman to play the role she did." She turned, pointing straight at Clara. "We owe her no sympathy. We owe her condemnation." By now, the fire had spread. People who had once judged me, pitied me, whispered about me, were now condemning her. The shift was palpable. The room no longer belonged to Clara. It belonged to the truth. Even the priest, who had stood frozen through most of it, finally spoke. His voice was heavy with disappointment. "A funeral is meant to honor the dead and comfort the living. What I've witnessed today is a desecration, not by the widow, who has shown courage in the face of betrayal, but by the mistress who chose this moment to flaunt her pride." His words were final, a benediction of judgment. Clara tried to move, tried to speak, but each attempt was drowned out by the rustle of the crowd, by their collective disapproval. Her voice, once loud and commanding, was reduced to a whimper. Her face flushed red, her hands trembling. She looked at me with something between fury and desperation, but I did not look away. I had nothing more to say. The crowd had spoken for me, and in that moment I realized the betrayal was no longer my private wound. It was a communal scar, one that everyone in that room now carried. They were witnesses not only to my pain, but to her cruelty, his lies, and my resilience. The story was no longer mine alone. It had become public, undeniable. seared into the memory of every person who sat in that pew. When Clara finally fled the church, her heels clattering against the stone, the silence that followed was not pity for her. It was solidarity with me. And for the first time in months, I felt the warmth of allies surrounding me. I was no longer alone. The funeral ended in silence, but it was not the kind of silence that follows prayer. It was the heavy quiet of judgment, of eyes refusing to meet one another because the truth had been laid bare too starkly to ignore. People filed out slowly, murmuring among themselves, stealing glances at me with something different from pity. Respect, maybe. Recognition, even guilt. They had doubted me, whispered about me. Some had even blamed me. But now, none of them could deny what they had seen. Clara had fled the church before the final hymn, her heels clattering down the aisle like the retreat of a defeated soldier. She left behind not only the shame of exposure, but the evidence that would follow her everywhere. The whispers would chase her in the streets, at her work, in every circle she thought she belonged to. She had wanted to claim a legacy. Instead, she had inherited infamy. For me, the aftermath was not triumph. Not yet. It was exhaustion. I returned home that evening and sank into the sofa, still in my black dress, my hands limp in my lap. The house was quiet, the children upstairs, their silence heavier than words. I closed my eyes and listened to the ticking clock, to the sound of my own breath, and wondered if I had really done it. Had I destroyed her, or had I only survived her? The next day, the phone rang incessantly, neighbors calling to apologize, friends who had stayed away now begging forgiveness. "We didn't know," they said. "We're so sorry." Sorry was a word that tasted bitter on my tongue. Where were their voices when I was drowning? Where was their support when I was humiliated? But I said nothing. I let them talk, let them stumble over apologies they should have made months ago. His family, on the other hand, had nothing to say to me. My mother-in-law avoided my eyes entirely, her face pale, her mouth tight. She left the church without a word, clutching her daughter's arm as if I were the villain. Perhaps it was easier for her to believe that, easier than admitting her perfect son had been capable of such betrayal. My sister-in-law glared at me, but even she could not muster the courage to speak. Their silence was its own confession, and I accepted it like a verdict. But the law did not stay silent. Richard filed motions the very next week, armed with the documents I had exposed. Clara was named in financial disputes, her accounts scrutinized, her promises unraveling in courtrooms where the drama was no longer mine alone to carry. The bank, once threatening foreclosure, now paused, recognizing her involvement in the manipulation. For the first time in months, I felt the ground beneath my feet stop shifting. It was not solid yet, but it was no longer quicksand. The children were quiet, watchful. My eldest avoided me for days after the funeral, until one evening he came into the kitchen where I was washing dishes. He stood there awkwardly, his hands shoved in his pockets, before finally blurting, "I'm sorry, Mom, for not saying anything sooner, for not believing you." His voice cracked, and in that moment I saw not the boy who had betrayed me with his silence, but the son who was ashamed of his father and desperate to cling to what was left of his mother. I wiped my hands and pulled him into my arms. "We both wanted to believe in him," I whispered. "That doesn't make us weak. It makes us human." My daughter, always sharper, always angrier, took longer to come around. She had screamed at me once, accusing me of letting Clara win. After the funeral, she avoided me entirely, slamming doors, staying out late. But one night, I found a note on my pillow, written in her messy handwriting. "I saw you, Mom. You were stronger than all of them. I'm proud of you." I pressed that note to my chest and wept quietly, because sometimes victory doesn't roar. It whispers through the cracks of broken hearts. As for Clara, I heard pieces of her downfall through the same grapevine that had once poisoned me. She lost her job. Her landlord asked her to leave. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be seen with the woman who had disgraced herself so publicly. Some said she planned to move away, to start over somewhere no one knew her name. But names travel. Scandals travel faster. She would never outrun it completely. The most surprising change was within myself. For months I had been a ghost in my own life, a woman erased by betrayal. But after the funeral, after the evidence, after the voices that rose to support me, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. The debts were still there, the grief was still sharp, the wounds were still raw. But I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor, and survival has its own kind of power. I began to move differently, to speak differently. At the grocery store, people who once avoided my gaze now greeted me with respect. At church, whispers no longer stung, because they were no longer about me, they were about her. And at home, I found myself breathing easier, no longer waiting for the next lie, the next humiliation. Silence, once suffocating, became peace. The aftermath was not a fairy tale ending. There was no perfect closure, no neat bow tied around the wreckage of my marriage. But there was dignity, reclaimed and restored. And dignity, once returned, is worth more than love lost, more than money spent, more than the years stolen by betrayal. Weeks passed after the funeral, and the echoes of that day lingered like shadows stretching across my life. Yet as time moved forward, I began to notice something I hadn't felt in months. Light creeping back into the corners where betrayal had once suffocated me. I no longer woke with the dread of what secret might surface next. I no longer feared the silence of my home. Instead, I discovered something far more powerful than revenge, the quiet strength of surviving and standing tall after everyone tried to bury me. One morning, I walked into the garden I had neglected for so long. The roses were withered, the soil dry, but I knelt there anyway, pressing my hands into the earth. As I dug, planting new bulbs, I realized that this was what my life had become. Soil stripped bare, poisoned by lies, but still fertile enough to bloom again. With each handful of earth, I whispered, "You thought you erased me, but here I am, rooted, alive." My children began to smile again. My daughter sat beside me one evening, holding the note she had once left on my pillow. "You really are stronger than all of us," she said softly. My son fixed the broken leg of the old dining chair, a simple act that felt like a promise. Things can be mended, even if scars remain. We were not whole, but we were healing. As for me, I stopped wearing the widow's veil. I stopped shrinking under stares and whispers. I walked into town with my head high, my steps firm, no longer the woman who carried shame, but the woman who had faced it, fought it, and come out with her dignity intact. The same neighbors who once looked at me with pity now nodded in respect. Some even thanked me, saying my courage gave them the strength to face their own hidden betrayals. I stood in front of his grave one final time before winter set in, a single white rose in my hand. The marble was cold beneath my touch, the engraved name almost mocking. I whispered, "You broke my heart. You left me with nothing but pain, but you will never take my dignity again." I laid the rose down and walked away without looking back. That chapter was closed, and now I speak to you, the one listening to my story. What would you do if the person you loved most turned your life into ashes? If the one you trusted chose betrayal over loyalty? Would you crumble, or would you rise? Betrayal is fire. It burns, it scars, but it also reveals what cannot be destroyed: dignity, strength, the will to survive. So if you are listening, if my words have found a place in your heart, I ask you, do not let betrayal define you. Do not let shame silence you. Speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. Defend your dignity, even when the world doubts you. Because when the lies are stripped away, when the false lovers and the hollow promises fade, All that remains is who you are when you choose to rise. I rose, and so can you. If you believe dignity must always triumph over betrayal, leave the word dignity in the comments. Share this story so no one forgets that even in the darkest betrayals, there is a path back to light. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories of survival, justice, and the strength we find when we finally choose ourselves. This was not the end of my life. It was the beginning.